I'm Marcus Thompson, and I watched my family lawyer's lips move for 23 minutes without hearing my name once. Not once. While my brother Kevin inherited the restaurant I'd secretly kept from bankruptcy, while my sister Jessica got the house I'd helped pay the mortgage on during the pandemic, while even my brother-in-law Carlos received Dad's vintage Mustang, I sat there invisible. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that the thriving business they were so eagerly dividing up would have been a pile of debt and foreclosure notices if not for the $80,000 I'd quietly transferred from my own accounts 3 years ago. But in that sterile law office in downtown Portland, surrounded by the scent of leather-bound books and my family's barely contained greed, I realized something profound. They hadn't just forgotten my contribution, they had erased me entirely. The golden boy Kevin, 38 and still living off Dad's approval, smiled smugly as Patricia Wells read his inheritance. My sister Jessica, radiant as always with her perfect marketing executive smile, dabbed fake tears while calculating the property values. And there I sat, the family ghost, the one who'd saved everything they were now claiming as their birthright. Have you ever been rendered completely invisible by the people who should know your worth better than anyone? They thought they were reading a will. They were actually announcing a war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The story really began 18 months earlier, though I didn't recognize it as the opening act of my own liberation at the time. I was sitting in my sleek office in Portland's Silicon Forest, surrounded by 3 monitors displaying cascading code and client analytics, when my phone buzzed with a text from my sister Jessica. Family dinner's Sunday. Mom's making her famous lasagna. You better come this time, Marcus. The passive-aggressive undertone was vintage Jessica, wrapped in familial obligation with just enough guilt to make refusal seem selfish. I stared at the message for a long moment, watching the cursor blink on my current project, a data migration system for a Fortune 500 company that would net my consulting firm, Thompson Digital Solutions, another 6-figure contract. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was building digital empires for corporate clients, my own family still saw me as the awkward kid who preferred computers to people. Sunday dinner at the Thompson house in Beaverton was a ritual I'd been avoiding for months, not out of malice but out of self-preservation. These gatherings followed a predictable script. Kevin would hold court about his latest schemes to modernize Dad's restaurant, Thompson's Table, while Jessica regaled everyone with stories from her marketing firm's latest campaigns. Mom would beam with pride at her 2 golden children while I sat quietly, picking at my food, contributing the occasional technical suggestion that would be politely dismissed. But something in Jessica's text felt different, more urgent than her usual family summons. Maybe it was the guilt, or maybe it was the growing distance I felt from the people who were supposed to matter most. But I found myself typing back, "I'll be there." The Thompson family home hadn't changed much since my childhood. The same burgundy leather furniture dominated the living room. The same gallery wall of family photos traced our history from awkward school pictures to wedding shots, though I noticed my Stanford graduation photo had somehow migrated to the back corner behind a larger print of Jessica's wedding day. Mom answered the door with her usual perfunctory hug, the kind that felt more like a social obligation than maternal affection. "Marcus, honey, you look thin. Are you eating enough?" Linda Thompson had perfected the art of expressing concern while simultaneously implying inadequacy. At 64, she remained the family's emotional conductor, orchestrating interactions with subtle cues and strategic attention distribution. The dining room was already set with Mom's good china, the Wedgwood pattern she'd inherited from her own mother and guarded like crown jewels. Kevin was leaning back in Dad's chair, his broad frame filling the space with characteristic confidence. At 41, my older brother had inherited Dad's sturdy build and easy charm, qualities that had always made him the presumptive heir to everything Thompson. He greeted me with a hearty backslap that was meant to convey brotherhood, but always felt more like dominance assertion. "Look who decided to join the real world," Kevin boomed, his laughter echoing off the dining room walls. "Put down the computer long enough to eat with the family." Jessica, elegant in a cream cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, smiled brilliantly. At 35, she had perfected the art of looking effortlessly put together, her auburn hair falling in precise waves, her makeup subtle but flawless. We were just talking about how busy everyone's been. Carlos closed 3 houses this month, and my team just landed the Morrison Hotel account. Her husband Carlos, a real estate agent with perfectly styled hair and an expensive watch, nodded modestly while clearly basking in the praise. The market's been crazy good to us. Jessica's been incredible, networking with all her contacts. I settled into my usual spot, the chair that faced away from the kitchen, the one that somehow always felt like the afterthought position. Congratulations, that sounds like a big account. It is, Jessica beamed. We're handling their entire rebranding campaign. It's going to be featured in Pacific Northwest magazine. Mom emerged from the kitchen carrying her famous lasagna, the recipe she'd perfected over decades of Sunday dinners. The rich aroma of garlic, basil, and 3 kinds of cheese filled the room, instantly transporting me back to childhood memories when these gatherings felt warm instead of competitive. "And how's your little computer business, Marcus?" Mom asked as she served generous portions. The word little wasn't accidental. Despite Thompson Digital Solutions employing 12 people and generating well into 7 figures annually, my family had never quite grasped the scale of what I'd built. It's going well. We just signed a major contract with Cascade Industries. Kevin perked up at this. Those are the people who own half the warehouses in the industrial district, right? Must be good money in that. I nodded, not mentioning that the contract was worth more than the restaurant's annual revenue. I'd learned long ago that discussing my financial success only seemed to make family gatherings more uncomfortable. "That's wonderful, dear," Mom said with the same tone she might use to praise a child's finger painting. "It's so nice that you found something you're good at." The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. Kevin dominated the discussion with his plans for Thompson's Table, his vision for expanding the catering business, his ideas for a second location. Jessica chimed in with marketing insights, her professional vocabulary peppered with terms like, quote, brand synergy and, quote, target demographics. Carlos contributed real estate wisdom about location scouting and property values. I found myself studying the family photos on the sideboard, particularly one from last Christmas, where Kevin and Jessica flanked Dad while I stood slightly apart, somehow always positioned as the outsider even in family portraits. Dad had been 68 then, still vital and passionate about his restaurant, still believing that his legacy would live on through his children. "Marcus, you're being awfully quiet," Jessica observed, her tone carrying just enough concern to sound caring while drawing attention to my lack of participation. "Just listening." "Sounds like everyone's doing really well. You should come by the restaurant more often," Kevin suggested. "Dad's always asking about you. I think he wishes you showed more interest in the family business." There it was, the familiar refrain. The implication that my success in technology somehow represented a betrayal of family values. That choosing a different path meant I cared less about our shared history. The truth was more complicated. I loved Thompson's Table. Loved the way Dad's eyes lit up when he talked about perfecting his grandmother's marinara recipe. Loved the loyal customers who'd been coming for decades. But I also understood that love didn't automatically translate to aptitude, and my talents lay in different directions. "Maybe I will," I said, though we all knew it was a polite deflection. As the evening wound down, I helped Mom clear the dishes, a ritual that felt more comfortable than the dinner conversation. In the kitchen, away from Kevin's booming voice and Jessica's performance, I found a momentary peace. "I worry about you, Marcus," Mom said as she rinsed plates. "You spend so much time alone with those computers. When are you going to find a nice girl and settle down like your brother and sister?" The question hung in the air like steam from the dishwater. How could I explain that my girlfriend Sarah, a talented graphic designer who understood my work and shared my interests, had been in my life for 2 years? How could I tell her that Sarah had never been invited to these family dinners? That somehow my relationships never seemed to count in the family narrative? "I'm seeing someone," I said quietly. "Her name's Sarah. She's a graphic designer." Mom's eyebrows rose with mild interest. "Oh, why haven't you brought her around?" The honest answer was too complicated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Because these dinners were performances where I always felt like I was playing the wrong part. Because Sarah was smart enough to recognize the dynamics that made me feel diminished. Because I'd learned to compartmentalize my life, keeping the parts that mattered to me separate from the family gatherings where I felt like a stranger. Maybe next time, I said instead. 3 weeks later, everything changed. I was working late on a Thursday evening, debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Thompson's table, which was unusual since the restaurant had been closed for hours. Marcus? Dad's voice sounded strained, tired in a way I'd never heard before. Can you come by? I need to talk to someone. I found him sitting alone in the empty restaurant, surrounded by the familiar red checkered tablecloths and wine bottle candles that had defined my childhood visits. The usually warm space felt cavernous and cold, lit only by the emergency lighting that cast long shadows across the walls lined with family photos and customer testimonials. Dad? What's wrong? Robert Thompson, 68 years old and usually as solid as the industrial-grade stoves in his kitchen, looked smaller somehow, diminished by whatever weight he was carrying. Sit down, son. We need to talk. The conversation that followed shattered every assumption I'd held about my family's financial stability. The restaurant, our family's pride and legacy, was drowning in debt. The failed expansion attempt 3 years earlier had left them overextended just as the pandemic hit. While other businesses received government assistance, Thompson's table fell through bureaucratic cracks, too small for major programs but too large for some of the targeted relief. We're looking at bankruptcy, Marcus. 36 years of building this place, and I'm going to lose it all. The numbers were staggering. $80,000 in combined debt from equipment loans, unpaid suppliers, and deferred rent during the shutdown months. The banks were calling in notes, suppliers were demanding payment, and the landlord was losing patience with partial rent payments. Why didn't you tell us sooner? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Dad's laugh was bitter. Tell who? Kevin thinks the solution to every problem is another grand plan. Jessica's got her own career to worry about. And you... He paused, looking at me with something that might have been regret. You built your own life. I didn't want to drag you into this mess. The assumption stung because it revealed how completely my family misunderstood me. They saw my success as evidence that I'd moved beyond caring about their struggles, when the truth was that I'd simply learned to stop offering help that was never requested or appreciated. What if there was a solution? I asked carefully. Marcus, this isn't your problem to solve. But what if it could be? Over the next hour, I laid out a plan that was as much about preserving dignity as it was about preserving the business. I would provide the necessary capital, but it would be structured as a business loan with reasonable terms. Dad could maintain his pride, the family could keep their legacy, and I could ensure that 36 years of work didn't disappear into bankruptcy court. I can't ask you to do this, son. You're not asking. I'm offering. The transfer happened quietly over the next few days. $80,000 moved from my business accounts to Thompson's table, enough to settle the debt, cover overdue bills, and provide working capital for recovery. I insisted on proper documentation, partly for tax purposes, but mostly to maintain the fiction that this was a standard business transaction rather than a family bailout. Dad wanted to tell Kevin and Jessica immediately, but I convinced him to wait. Let's see how the recovery goes first. No need to worry everyone unnecessarily. It was a decision I would later recognize as my first strategic mistake, though at the time it felt like kindness. I was protecting my siblings from the stress of knowing how close we'd come to losing everything, protecting Dad from having to admit the extent of his financial miscalculations, and protecting myself from the complicated gratitude and resentment that family financial help inevitably creates. The restaurant's recovery was swift and dramatic. With debt pressure removed and cash flow restored, Dad threw himself into revitalization with the energy of a man half his age. He upgraded equipment, refreshed the dining room, and expanded the menu with dishes he'd been wanting to try for years. Thompson's table transformed from a struggling family business into a thriving local institution. Within 6 months, we were booked solid most nights. Food bloggers discovered us, Portland Monthly featured our Osso Buco in their Hidden Gems issue, and Kevin started talking about expansion again, though this time with more realistic planning. I watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction, visiting more frequently to see Dad's renewed energy and the staff's obvious relief. Tony Ricci, the longtime manager who'd been with us for 15 years, pulled me aside one evening. "I don't know what your father did, but this place was dead in the water 6 months ago. Now look at it." I smiled and said nothing, content to let Dad take the credit he deserved for the turnaround's operational success. The family dynamic, however, remained unchanged. Kevin still dominated dinner conversations with his grand plans, now validated by the restaurant's success. Jessica still sparkled with professional accomplishments and social connections. And I still sat quietly, watching my family celebrate a victory I'd made possible, while treating me like a distant relative whose opinions carried little weight. It was sustainable, this arrangement. I had my successful business, my relationship with Sarah, my quiet satisfaction in having preserved the family legacy. I told myself that recognition wasn't important, that the outcome mattered more than credit. I was wrong, of course. The outcome and the recognition were about to become inseparable in ways I couldn't imagine, starting with a phone call that would shatter the careful distance I'd maintained between my public success and my private family role. But that phone call wouldn't come for another year. For now, I was content to be the invisible benefactor, the family member whose most significant contribution would remain a secret, the son who'd saved everything while asking for nothing in return. I had no idea that silence, like debt, eventually comes due with interest. The phone call that changed everything came on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, exactly 14 months after I'd quietly transferred that life-saving money to Thompson's table. I was reviewing quarterly reports for my tech consulting firm when Sarah walked into my home office, her face pale and drawn in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. "Marcus, your mom just called. It's your dad." The words hit me like ice water. Sarah's voice carried that careful tone people use when they're trying to cushion devastating news, but nothing could have prepared me for what followed. Dad had collapsed during the lunch rush at the restaurant. Massive heart attack. By the time the paramedics arrived, Robert Thompson, the man who'd built Thompson's Table from nothing, who'd poured his soul into every marinara recipe and customer interaction, was gone. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls, hurried drives through Portland traffic, and the surreal experience of seeing my larger-than-life father reduced to medical terminology and funeral arrangements. Kevin took charge immediately, his natural leadership instincts kicking in as he coordinated with hospitals, managed the restaurant staff, and fielded calls from longtime customers who'd heard the news. Jessica arrived from her marketing firm's downtown offices, her professional composure cracking just enough to reveal genuine grief beneath her polished exterior. She embraced Mom with the kind of dramatic emotion that felt both authentic and performative, tears flowing as she whispered reassurances about handling all the arrangements. I stood slightly apart from the family huddle, offering quiet support but somehow not quite fitting into the intimate circle of mourning. It wasn't intentional exclusion, just the natural dynamic that had defined our relationships for decades. Kevin and Jessica were the emotional centers of the family solar system, while I orbited at a comfortable distance. The funeral arrangements became another opportunity for my siblings to demonstrate their competence and devotion. Kevin handled all the restaurant logistics, ensuring that Thompson's Table could continue operating smoothly during the mourning period. He coordinated with Tony Ricci to maintain service standards and spoke personally with our biggest catering clients to reassure them about continuity. Jessica took charge of the memorial service itself, using her marketing expertise to create what she called a celebration worthy of Dad's legacy. She designed elegant programs, coordinated with the florist for arrangements that perfectly captured Dad's personality, and even hired a photographer to document the service for family records. I contributed what I could, handling the digital aspects that nobody else wanted to deal with. I created a memorial website where people could share stories and photos, managed the online obituary and its flood of heartfelt comments, and coordinated with Dad's oldest friends who lived out of state. It was meaningful work, but it felt invisible compared to my siblings' more visible contributions. The service itself was a testament to the impact Dad had made on his community. Thompson's Table had been more than just a restaurant. It had been a gathering place for celebrations, first dates, anniversary dinners, and family traditions spanning multiple generations. The funeral home was packed with customers who'd become friends, employees who'd become family, and suppliers who'd become partners in Dad's vision. I watched from the third row as Kevin delivered a eulogy that captured Dad's entrepreneurial spirit and dedication to excellence. Jessica spoke beautifully about family values and the importance of carrying forward his legacy. Both of them were genuinely moving, their love for Dad evident in every word. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. I talked about Dad's quiet wisdom, his ability to solve problems with patience and persistence, and his belief that success meant building something that lasted. I didn't mention the late-night phone call 14 months earlier, or the crisis that had threatened everything Dad had built. Some stories, I believed, belonged to the person who lived them. The reception afterward was held at Thompson's Table, naturally. The restaurant had never looked better, its warm lighting and family photos creating the perfect atmosphere for sharing memories and celebrating a life well lived. I found myself talking with Tony Ricci about Dad's management style, with longtime customers about their favorite dishes, and with Dad's brother about childhood stories I'd never heard before. "Your father was so proud of this place," Uncle Frank told me as we stood near the wall of family photos. "But you know what he was proudest of? His kids. All of you. He used to tell me that Kevin had the vision to take the restaurant into the future. Jessica had the smarts to handle anything life threw at her. And you..." He paused, studying my face. "You had the strength to succeed on your own terms." The comment stayed with me through the following weeks as our family settled into the strange new reality of life without Dad. Kevin immediately stepped into the role of restaurant owner, his transition so seamless it seemed like he'd been preparing for it his entire life. He implemented new efficiency systems, expanded the catering menu, and even started preliminary discussions about opening a second location. Jessica threw herself into supporting Mom through the grieving process, visiting daily and handling all the bureaucratic details that death inevitably requires. She coordinated with insurance companies, helped organize Dad's personal effects, and served as the family's primary communicator with extended relatives and family friends. I maintained my usual supportive but peripheral role, checking in regularly but not inserting myself into decisions that seemed to be handled capably by my siblings. My business continued to thrive, providing me with both financial security and professional satisfaction, while my relationship with Sarah deepened into something that felt permanent and meaningful. 3 months after the funeral, Mom asked us all to gather for Sunday dinner, the first one since Dad's death. The house felt different without his presence, smaller somehow, as if his absence had literally diminished the space. Kevin sat in Dad's chair, a transition that felt both natural and jarring. "I've been thinking about the future," Mom announced as we finished her lasagna, which tasted exactly the same but somehow felt like an echo of better times. "About what your father would have wanted for all of us." Jessica leaned forward attentively. "What do you mean, Mom?" "The restaurant is Kevin's now, obviously. Your father always intended that. But I want to make sure we're all on the same page about the family's future." Kevin nodded confidently. "I've got big plans, Mom. Dad built something incredible, and I want to honor that by taking it to the next level. The second location could be reality within 2 years if we play our cards right. And Jessica, you've been such a help with everything. Your father always said you had the best head for business in the family." Jessica smiled, the kind of radiant expression that had charmed teachers, bosses, and clients throughout her life. "I just want to support whatever's best for the family. Maybe I could help with the marketing for the expansion." All eyes turned to me. I felt the familiar sensation of being the afterthought, the family member whose role was less defined and therefore less important. "I'm here for whatever you need," I said, the same diplomatic response I'd been giving at family gatherings for decades. "That's what I love about you, Marcus," Mom said with a smile that felt both affectionate and dismissive. "You're so independent, so self-sufficient. Your father always said you'd be fine, no matter what happened." The subtext was clear. Kevin needed the restaurant, Jessica needed to feel involved, but Marcus would be fine with whatever scraps remained. It was an assessment that might have been accurate in many ways, but it completely ignored the role I'd played in ensuring there was anything left to inherit. Over the following months, I watched Kevin transform Thompson's table with impressive energy and vision. He modernized the point-of-sale system, upgraded the kitchen equipment, and expanded the staff to handle increased demand. The restaurant's success continued to grow, exceeding even Dad's best years. Jessica contributed marketing expertise that helped establish Thompson's Table as a Portland dining destination rather than just a neighborhood restaurant. She created social media campaigns that attracted food bloggers, coordinated with local food festivals, and even arranged for a feature in Sunset magazine that brought customers from across the Pacific Northwest. I remained the supportive brother, celebrating their successes and offering technical help when asked. When Kevin needed a new website for the restaurant, I designed and built it personally. When Jessica wanted to implement online ordering, I researched and recommended the best platforms. When Mom needed help managing Dad's digital accounts and online presence, I handled it quietly and efficiently. But as the months passed, I began to notice something troubling in how my family discussed the restaurant's success. In their version of the story, Kevin's leadership and Jessica's marketing had transformed a struggling business into a thriving enterprise. Dad's death had actually sparked a renaissance, they suggested, as the new generation brought fresh energy to an old-fashioned operation. The narrative wasn't entirely wrong. Kevin and Jessica had contributed significantly to the restaurant's continued growth, but it was incomplete in a way that made me increasingly uncomfortable. The crisis that had nearly destroyed everything, the $80,000 that had made recovery possible, the months of uncertainty when bankruptcy seemed inevitable, all of that had been erased from the family history. I told myself it didn't matter. I hadn't provided that money for recognition or gratitude. I'd done it to preserve Dad's legacy and maintain family stability. The outcome was what mattered, not who received credit for achieving it. But as Kevin began making plans for expansion and Jessica talked about leaving her marketing job to work for the restaurant full-time, I realized that the forgotten crisis had implications beyond hurt feelings. They were making major decisions based on an incomplete understanding of the business's recent history and current financial position. "Kevin, have you reviewed all the loan documents lately?" I asked during one family dinner, trying to broach the subject indirectly. "What loan documents?" he replied, genuinely puzzled. "From when Dad was dealing with the financial problems. Before he died." Kevin and Jessica exchanged glances. "What financial problems?" Jessica asked. "The restaurant was doing great when Dad died. That's why the transition has been so smooth." I realized then that Dad had kept his word about not worrying the family unnecessarily. He'd told them about securing additional capital, but he'd apparently described it as a standard business loan rather than emergency financing to prevent bankruptcy. In their minds, Dad had simply been savvy about leveraging the restaurant's success for expansion capital. "Right," I said, letting the moment pass. "I just wanted to make sure you had all the information you needed." The conversation moved on, but I was left with a growing sense of unease. My siblings were planning their futures based on a version of events that didn't include my contribution. More concerning, they were making financial commitments that assumed a level of security that might not actually exist. The loan I'd provided had been structured with generous terms, essentially a family gift disguised as business financing. But legally, it was still a debt that could theoretically be called in. If something happened to me, if my own business faced unexpected challenges, if any number of scenarios played out differently than expected, that $80,000 could become a very real problem for Thompson's Table. I found myself in an impossible position. Revealing the truth would shatter my siblings' confidence and possibly damage family relationships. But staying silent meant watching them make potentially risky decisions based on incomplete information. The dilemma intensified when Kevin announced his engagement to a woman named Rachel, a successful attorney he'd met through the restaurant's catering business. The engagement party, naturally, was held at Thompson's Table, with Jessica coordinating every detail to ensure a perfect evening that would showcase both the family's happiness and the restaurant's elegance. I attended with Sarah, who had finally started joining these family gatherings after 2 years of being politely excluded. Her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, though she handled the subtle social dynamics with grace and humor. "Your family really loves this place," she observed as we watched Kevin and Rachel receive congratulations from a room full of customers turned friends. "It's Dad's legacy," I replied. "Everything he worked for. And Kevin's carrying it forward beautifully. It must be satisfying to see the family business thriving." I nodded, not trusting myself to explain the complex emotions churning beneath my surface agreement. It was satisfying to see the business thriving. It was less satisfying to watch my contribution be systematically erased from the story of that success. The engagement announcement also meant wedding expenses, honeymoon plans, and the kinds of financial commitments that young couples make when they believe their futures are secure. Kevin talked confidently about his plans to expand the restaurant's catering division, investments that would require significant capital but promised substantial returns. Jessica, inspired by the restaurant's success and Kevin's happiness, began seriously considering leaving her marketing job to join the family business full-time. "I could handle all the promotional work, maybe even develop a Thompson's Table brand that could support multiple locations," she explained to the family with obvious excitement. I watched these plans develop with growing anxiety. Both of my siblings were making life-changing decisions based on their belief that Thompson's Table was an unshakably successful business with unlimited potential. They had no idea how close the restaurant had come to complete failure, or how much of their current security depended on my continued financial backing. The weight of keeping that secret was becoming unbearable, but revealing it seemed equally impossible. How do you tell your family that their success story is built on a foundation they don't know exists? How do you explain that their confidence in the future is based on your past generosity without seeming to demand gratitude or recognition? The answer I was beginning to understand was that you don't. You either stay silent and watch potential disaster unfold, or you find a way to ensure that the truth comes out naturally, through circumstances rather than confession. I didn't know it then, but those circumstances were already in motion. Dad's death had triggered a series of legal and financial reviews that would eventually surface every detail of the restaurant's recent history. The secret I'd kept to protect my family's feelings was about to be exposed whether I wanted it to be or not. The catalyst would come in the form of estate planning, tax documents, and a family lawyer's attention to detail. Patricia Wells had been handling Dad's legal affairs for over a decade, and she was exactly the kind of thorough professional who noticed when financial records didn't quite align with family narratives. But that revelation was still months away. For now, I continued playing my role as the supportive brother, the successful but peripheral family member whose own accomplishments were acknowledged but never quite celebrated, with the same enthusiasm reserved for Kevin's restaurant achievements or Jessica's marketing victories. I had no idea that my patient silence was about to be shattered by a reading of Dad's will that would force every hidden truth into the harsh light of legal documentation. The same generosity that had saved Thompson's Table was about to become the instrument of my family's most devastating awakening. The first crack in my carefully maintained silence appeared on a Thursday afternoon in March, 6 months after Dad's funeral. I was debugging a particularly complex database integration for a healthcare client when my phone buzzed with a text from Michael Foster, the accountant who'd been handling Dad's books for over a decade. "Marcus, can you call me when you get a chance? Found something in your father's records that doesn't add up." Michael had been Dad's financial advisor since the restaurant's early days, one of those old-school accountants who still believed in personal relationships and handwritten ledgers alongside digital spreadsheets. He'd guided Dad through tax seasons, expansion decisions, and the complex financial maze of running a small business for over 20 years. I called him back immediately, stepping out of my office into the hallway where my employees couldn't overhear what I suspected might be a complicated conversation. "Michael, it's Marcus. What's going on?" "Well, I'm trying to get everything organized for the estate filing, and I found some discrepancies in the restaurant's financial records from 2020. There's an $80,000 capital injection that your father recorded as a business loan, but I can't find any corresponding bank documents or formal lending agreements." My stomach dropped. In all my careful planning around the rescue financing, I'd somehow overlooked the fact that Dad's meticulous record-keeping would eventually be scrutinized by professionals who understood the difference between legitimate business loans and family emergency funding. The money definitely came in, Michael continued, his tone puzzled rather than accusatory. The restaurant's books show it clearly, and it's what turned their cash flow situation around. But there's no lender information, no repayment schedule, no interest calculations. It's like the money just appeared. I found myself at a crossroads I'd been avoiding for months. I could continue the fiction that had protected everyone's feelings, or I could finally acknowledge the truth that Dad's death had made inevitable. Michael, I need to tell you something, but I'd prefer to do it in person. Can we meet tomorrow? Of course. This is probably something we should discuss face-to-face anyway. The next morning, I drove to Michael's office in downtown Portland, a cramped space above a coffee shop that smelled perpetually of roasted beans and printer toner. Michael Foster was exactly what Central Casting would order for a small business accountant: wire-rimmed glasses, rumpled cardigan, and the kind of methodical attention to detail that made him invaluable to clients like Dad. "So what's the story with this mysterious $80,000? He asked as I settled into the chair across from his desk. I took a deep breath and told him everything. The late-night phone call, Dad's confession about the restaurant's financial crisis, the decision to structure my contribution as a business loan to preserve his dignity, and the family's continued ignorance about how close Thompson's table had come to complete failure. Michael listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "So you saved the family business, but nobody knows about it except you and your deceased father." "That's right. And now Kevin and Jessica are making major life decisions based on their belief that the restaurant has always been financially stable." "Exactly." Michael removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture I recognized as his way of processing complicated information. "Marcus, I have to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you want this to remain a secret?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Did I want it to remain a secret? The easy answer was yes. That I'd provided the money without expectation of recognition or gratitude. That keeping the peace was more important than setting the record straight. But the honest answer was more complicated. I was tired of being invisible. Tired of watching my siblings build their futures on a foundation they didn't understand. Tired of being the family member whose contributions were acknowledged with polite thanks and quickly forgotten. "I don't know," I admitted. "I didn't do it for recognition, but watching them plan major life changes based on incomplete information is making me uncomfortable." "There's another issue," Michael said, replacing his glasses and consulting his notes. "For estate tax purposes, I need to account for all of your father's assets and liabilities. This $80,000 loan is technically a debt of the restaurant, which affects the overall valuation of what Kevin is inheriting." I hadn't considered the tax implications. If Thompson's table was being valued as part of Dad's estate, the outstanding loan would reduce its assessed worth, potentially affecting inheritance taxes and the distribution of assets among beneficiaries. What happens if I forgive the loan? That would be considered a gift, which has its own tax implications. And it would need to be documented properly, which means Kevin would find out about it. And if I don't forgive it? Then it remains a legitimate business debt that Kevin inherits along with the restaurant. He'll discover it when he reviews the complete financial records. Either way, I realized, the secret wasn't going to stay secret much longer. The legal and financial machinery set in motion by Dad's death was going to expose every detail of the restaurant's recent history, regardless of what I wanted or how it might affect family dynamics. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked. "The estate filing deadline is in 6 weeks. I need to have all the documentation sorted out by then." I left Michael's office with a sense of impending inevitability. The careful balance I'd maintained for over a year was about to be disrupted whether I chose to act or not. The only question was whether I wanted to control the narrative or let it unfold through legal documents and accounting reports. That evening, I found myself sitting in my condo's kitchen, staring at my laptop screen and a document I'd never thought I'd need to write. Sarah was working late on a client project, giving me the solitude I needed to process the day's revelations. The document was a formal loan forgiveness letter, the kind of legal paperwork that would officially release Thompson's table from its $80,000 debt to me. Writing it felt like signing away not just money, but the last evidence of the role I'd played in preserving the family legacy. But keeping the loan active felt like setting a trap for Kevin, creating a financial obligation he didn't know existed and couldn't plan for. Neither option felt right, but one of them was going to become necessary within the next few weeks. I called Sarah at her office, needing to talk through the decision with someone who understood both the emotional and practical dimensions of the situation. "You're overthinking this," she said after I explained the dilemma. "The question isn't whether to forgive the loan or keep it. The question is whether you want your family to find out about your contribution through legal documents or through a conversation with you." "What do you mean?" "Marcus, this secret is coming out no matter what you do. Michael's going to have to document everything for the estate filing. Kevin's going to see those records eventually, and your family is going to discover that their success story has a chapter they didn't know about." She was right, of course. I'd been so focused on managing the financial aspects that I'd missed the larger truth. The story was going to be told whether I told it or not. The only choice I had was whether to tell it myself or let them discover it through paperwork. So what do you think I should do? I think you should stop protecting people from reality. Your family is made up of adults who can handle complicated truths, and maybe it's time they understood what you actually contributed to their success. That night, I made a decision that felt both liberating and terrifying. I was going to tell them the truth, but not in the dramatic, confrontational way that would make it seem like I was demanding recognition or gratitude. I was going to tell them the way Dad should have told them, as a family business discussion that included all the relevant financial information. I called Kevin the next morning and asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss some restaurant business matters. He agreed immediately, probably assuming I had some technical suggestions or wanted to discuss the website updates I'd been working on. We met at a small cafe in the Pearl District, not far from Thompson's table. Kevin arrived looking confident and energetic, the way he always did when discussing the restaurant. He'd been thriving in his role as owner, and his enthusiasm for the business was infectious. "So what's on your mind?" he asked as we settled into a corner booth with our coffees. "Kevin, I need to tell you something about the restaurant's financial history. Something that Dad asked me to keep quiet, but that you need to know now." I watched his expression shift from casual interest to focused attention. "What kind of financial history?" I told him everything, starting with Dad's phone call that night in 2020 and ending with Michael Foster's discovery of the undocumented loan. I explained the crisis that had threatened to destroy everything Dad had built, the decision to provide emergency financing, and the reasons we'd kept the situation private. Kevin listened without interruption, his coffee growing cold as he processed information that fundamentally changed his understanding of the restaurant's recent history. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the busy street where lunch crowds were beginning to gather. $80,000, he finally said. "Yes." "And you never told anyone except Dad." "That's right. So when Jessica and I have been talking about how well the restaurant was doing when Dad died, how smoothly the transition went, how stable the business has always been, you were working with incomplete information." Kevin's jaw tightened. "Jesus, Marcus, do you realize what this means?" "I've been making plans, Rachel and I have been making plans, based on thinking this business was bulletproof. I had no idea we'd been that close to losing everything. You weren't going to lose everything. That's why I stepped in. But I didn't know that. I've been operating for a year thinking I inherited a successful business, when what I actually inherited was a business that you saved." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. Kevin asked detailed questions about the restaurant's financial position, the terms of the loan, and what it meant for his expansion plans. He was processing not just the financial information, but the emotional reality of learning that his confidence in the business had been built on his brother's hidden generosity. "I need to tell Jessica," he said finally. "And, Mom, they deserve to know the truth." "I know. That's why I'm telling you now, instead of letting you find out through the estate paperwork." "The estate paperwork?" I explained about Michael Foster's discovery and the impending deadline for documenting all of Dad's assets and liabilities. Kevin's face went pale as he realized how close the family had come to learning about the crisis through legal documents, rather than family conversation. "We need to have a family meeting," he said. "All of us. Tonight." That evening, I found myself sitting in Mom's living room, the same space where we'd shared countless Sunday dinners and family celebrations. But tonight felt different, charged with the tension of secrets about to be revealed and relationships about to be fundamentally altered. Jessica arrived looking puzzled, having been told only that there was important family business to discuss. Mom seemed more curious than concerned, probably assuming we were going to talk about Kevin's expansion plans or Jessica's ideas for joining the business full-time. Kevin took the lead, explaining what I'd told him that morning and providing context for why the information was surfacing now. I watched Jessica's face change as she processed the implications, her marketing professional's mind immediately grasping how completely this altered the family's narrative about the restaurant's success. "You mean when we've been celebrating the restaurant's recovery, talking about Dad's business acumen, planning for the future," she said slowly. "We've been celebrating Marcus's money?" "It's not that simple," I said. "Dad turned the business around operationally. I just provided the capital to make that possible. But without your $80,000, there wouldn't have been anything to turn around." The room fell silent as the full weight of the revelations settled over everyone. Mom looked stunned, as if she were trying to reconcile this new information with her understanding of the family's history. Jessica seemed to be calculating the implications for all the plans she'd been making. Kevin just looked tired, the burden of learning that his inheritance came with complications he'd never imagined. "Why didn't you tell us?" Mom asked finally, her voice small and hurt. "Because Dad asked me not to. He was embarrassed about the financial crisis, and he wanted to protect everyone from worrying about something that was already being handled." "But Marcus," Jessica said, "don't you see how this changes everything? All the credit Kevin and I have been taking, all the plans we've been making, all the confidence we've had in the business, it's all been based on not knowing about your contribution." I realized then that the conversation I'd intended to be about financial transparency had become something much more complicated. My family wasn't just learning about a business loan. They were learning that their understanding of their own success had been fundamentally incomplete. And that realization was about to set in motion a chain of events that would completely transform our family dynamics in ways none of us could have anticipated. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.